in one way or another, there's going to be an aftermath. It's very important to try to minimize the negative consequences of the aftermath and try to look for those experiences following a tragedy or an emotional trauma that are positive, that in some way develop or help you become more resilient.
Welcome to the Vistage podcast series. I'm Dave Nelson, a Vistage member since 2003, part of CEO Group 676 in Pittsburgh, and your podcast host. Today we're talking about coping with the emotional impact of natural disasters and other traumatic events. In fact, we're recording this as people in the Caribbean and the southern and eastern U.S. are digging out from two monster storms, hurricanes. My guest today is Dr. Roy Aranda, a clinical and forensic psychologist. Dr. Aranda, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Let me tell people just a little bit about you, and then we'll jump into it. Dr. Aranda has a long bio, but most relevant for today, was actively involved in crisis work after 9/11. He created an organization called Sunshine Fund while attending law school to provide relief to students who were affected by Hurricane Katrina. Dr. Aranda was also actively involved in relief efforts in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy and other traumatic events. So let's jump into it, talking about the emotional impact of these sorts of things.
Well, once again, thank you for having me here. Let me just give you a little bit of slide with a little bit of my background. I don't want to belabor it. Normally, I would say that I'm really delighted to be doing a presentation to an audience, and I do want to say that I regret the circumstances under which we have to do this. I mean, it's obviously sad when you have tragedies such as these. And originally, I had envisioned preparing a presentation on the emotional impact pursuant to Hurricane Harvey, and then we had the other beast, Hurricane Irma. So, of course, my heart goes out to the victims and to the people who were affected in Florida and Texas and the Caribbean. I myself, have family who have been affected in Puerto Rico, and many of my patients have family and loved ones in Texas and Florida. So, without further ado, I did want to point out that I've done a tremendous amount of work in the area of PTSD, emotional trauma. It goes back actually to the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993, and then certainly after 9/11, it was a source of major interest to me, and I've been down to ground zero many times. And we just recently celebrated. I don't want to call it a celebration. We just recently had the 16th anniversary of that tragic day, 9/11. So there are many syndromes, there are many psychological disorders that people placed in harm's way, either by a human-made traumatic event or a natural disaster experience. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is probably the most salient, the most significant, the one that we're the most prevalent, the one that we see most often. There are others, chronic depressions and other anxiety disorders, and reliance on substances and medications to calm the effects of the anxiety. But PTSD, this is an anxiety disorder, and this is seen in individuals who've been exposed to a very traumatic or disturbing, frightening experience, certainly such as hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and of course the impact of 9/11 and other such traumas. It's recognized officially in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychological Association. Just to give you an idea of how the prevalence, how often we see this kind of disorder, it's huge. It's affecting about a little bit under 8 million adults a year. We have anywhere between 15% and 43% of children who have suffered a traumatic incident. It's perhaps a little bit more difficult with children to assess and see it because parents may not be aware of it, or they don't bring it to the attention of a professional, which is why the range is as large as it is. It certainly affects both girls and boys. There may be different reasons why one sex over another. Girls, for instance, women may be more exposed to sexual incidents and sexual trauma, and boys would not. They might be exposed more to violent acts and assaults and gang-related or bullying kinds of incidents at school. Just to tell you that we are certainly in for the long haul here. The cleanup for Hurricanes Harvey and Irma will last for years. We're still looking at damage from leftover and remnants of Hurricane Katrina, and by that I mean, physical, financial, as well as emotional. The emotional damage lingers for many years, perhaps even lifelong, decades. And in my neck of the woods, I live in Long Island, New York. We still have the after effects of the superstorm Sandy. These are some of the causes or some of the reasons why people may be experiencing PTSD, natural disasters. You see at the top, hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards, man-made or human-made disasters, war, social unrest, deadly fires that are caused by arson, acts of terror. I referred to 9/11 before. Recently, we had the horrible tragedy in Barcelona, Spain. Acts of violence, child abuse, sexual assault, rape, rioting, urban violence. Go back not too long ago to what happened in Charlottesville. Accidents, airplane crashes, serious car accidents, train wrecks, ship navigation, maritime kinds of disasters, people stuck in elevators or elevators that fall, stampedes, life-threatening illnesses could lead to PTSD, and captivity when you're dealing with the child exploitation rings and prostitution, and people are held hostage. Long-term domestic violence victims who repeatedly, over and over and over again, are exposed to trauma by virtue of the circumstances in which they live. Some of the symptoms, I'm going to share with you symptoms for adults as well as children. Most typical, you will see recollections, what I refer to at the top as intrusive thoughts. These are recurrent thoughts about what happened. Flashbacks. Flashbacks are vivid, usually visual, although it's not, doesn't have to be exclusively visual. Recollections of the event as if you're reliving it, you're seeing it, almost like you're back there again. I've also had many patients report auditory flashbacks, so they may actually hear a crash or they hear the sound of a car accident or screams from an incident. There may be smells associated with it. Consider 9/11 and all the deadly toxic fumes that were there. Nightmares. The nightmares may or may not be in some way similar to the traumatic event. They could be derivatives. Somebody may have been in a car accident and they're having nightmares of falling or being in an abyss or being run over by cars or being stabbed or chased. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an accurate representation of the incident. People who were that I worked with who were exposed to Superstorm Sandy, they were reporting being in flooded homes or seeing themselves floating in water, or family that they had already lost. Like for instance, they may have had deceased loved ones from the past all of a sudden coming to them in the dream, and in some difficult kind of a situation, a painful type of a memory or recollection. If you talk to the individuals about the event or they see something, they're going to experience physical reactions, intense distress. We at the onset of Hurricane Harvey, listening to the news over and over and over again, and the warning, and they're seeing maps They're seeing maps, meteorological maps showing, this is the hurricane approaching. They were exposed to this, and then were exposed to repeatedly the images of the devastation caused by the hurricane. After 9/11, people were seeing the towers fall repeatedly over and over and over again. This serves to, in some ways, perpetuate the PTSD. It keeps it going, it keeps it active, it keeps it alive. For those who were in Texas devastated by Harvey, you can imagine trying to recover, and many of them were relocated or they lost houses and injuries and property and loss of lives, and now they're watching the impact of Hurricane Irma. It's a different hurricane, but they're still seeing the images of it, and this leads to continued intense physical reactions and serves to fuel and feed the emotional distress. Some people get this amnesia. It's almost like they block aspects of the trauma. That may be a protective mechanism to try to save them or prevent them from really going into throes of despair, so that they may just really have blocked out or locked out certain aspects of the trauma. You're going to see these individuals suffering, these people suffering from PTSD. They're not interested in doing things. They become lethargic. They're emotionally detached. They may think their own life is going to be shortened. All of a sudden, they're placed in the possibility of actual loss of life, and they realize how fragile life is, so that they may be experiencing this sense of the foreshortened future. Sleep disturbance, very typical. Often it goes in two directions. It may be inability to sleep or staying in bed much of the day. It could be ups and downs, erratic sleep pattern. In some individuals, you see irritability, anger. They become angry and more irritable, and they snap at their loved ones, at their children, spouse. They just seem to have this short fuse. Difficulty focusing is very typical and common. Hypervigilance, you hear any sound, you'll be turning your head around. You hear something, you think, oh my God. All of a sudden, like a car makes a sound, and you've been in a car accident, you're on the street, you're shuddering, waiting for the impact, and startling easily. Guilt feelings, this is something that I've had patients report this. Why am I okay and I lost others? Why it didn't happen to me? Or perhaps, why is it that I didn't do better to protect my family? I should have listened to the cautions telling me to leave, to evacuate. Why didn't I do that? Look what happened because of me. There may be reliance on alcohol, tobacco, use of medications, and I don't necessarily mean that it's an addiction. It may mean more wine or more beer or alcohol to try to sedate yourself, be able to go to sleep. There's just something, you're more anxious, but it could in the long run lead to abuse. So it's something to be wary of. Depression is typical. For many, you experience what's known as a sense of hopelessness or helplessness. I'm never going to get out of this. Things won't be the same for me. I lost everything. Helplessness, I can't do anything. I'm at the mercy of the elements. People in shelters, for instance, people who had huge financial losses or physical consequences. Somatic complaints, these are physical consequences, stomach aches, headaches, bodily aches and pains. And of course, if somebody actually was injured, they would be experiencing pain from the injury as well. For children, depending on the age, I did want to point out that the experience of trauma for children does have a lot to do with their chronological age. So depending on the age, you have to be sensitive to different kinds of experiences and manifestations of PTSD. Separation anxiety for young children, they're afraid of leaving the side of their parents. All of a sudden, they tag along the mother or the father. They have to be in the same room, or they're afraid to be left alone, or they won't go to school. They don't want to go someplace without the parent. You may see regression. They'll go back to an earlier stage of development. Symbolic play. They'll engage in play kinds of activities that remind that may be reminiscent of the traumatic incident. One of the things that really prompted me to become interested in PTSD for me goes back to when I was 13 years old. And I'll just share quickly that on my 13th birthday, when I was in Valencia, Spain, I witnessed the after effect of a man who had been struck by a local commuter train and was killed. And I was going to visit my aunt, and I saw people people there from the train, employees who were covering areas where there had been blood with dirt. There was like a box that looked like a pine box. I can only imagine that the deceased was placed in the box, and I'm listening to people standing around talking and telling the story of what happened and who this man was. And I had so much wanted to have a train set. So my parents, I was in Valencia and my father was in New York. My father had sent money for my mother to buy me a train set. And that night I refused to go to bed. I had to stay up. I was afraid to go to bed. And then afterwards I was playing with the train, putting things in the track, derailing the train. All of that was symbolic play that, of course, now as an adult, I see this is so characteristic of manifestations of PTSD in children. There may be new fears, not only with children, but with adults. For instance, an adult in an accident or some sort of a traumatic event may now be afraid of going into trains, may be afraid of going over bridges, may be afraid of being in elevators. Fear of the dark for children, fear of sleeping alone. Behavioral changes, they can be more withdrawn, increasingly withdrawn, isolated. You also may see behavioral changes that are in an opposite direction, being more aggressive, more in the becoming bullying, or more volatile, talking back, snapping back, being moody, mood changes, enuresis, inability to control the retention of urine at night, so they'll start bedwetting. Physical complaints that even if you're not injured, you'll have children complain of tummy aches, something that hurts them. Changes in school performance. This is very telling. All of a sudden, you're getting complaints from school that the child's not focused, that the child's talking out, that the child's daydreaming, falling asleep, not paying attention, and performance starts to deteriorate. Very importantly, this is something that I really wanted the members, Vistage members, to have a good grasp. But in terms of responding to disasters and tragedies, you need to know who's your population, who is affected. We have had, for instance, a lot of discussion of the remnants and the consequences of Harvey and now Irma. But if you want to really get more specific, for instance, how were children affected? Were families who lost pets affected? Did you have people who are veterans? Are you looking at the population of veterans and veterans who are disabled, who may be amputees? Are you looking at elderly people, nursing homes? So you need to know who's your population, because you have huge numbers who are affected, and you need to concentrate and focus, if you're doing some rescue work, on particular subpopulations, if you will. Needs assessment. How were these people affected? For instance, loss of water, loss of home, loss of food, loss of finances. What's the extent? Was the entire city or town evacuated? What was the impact on immediate families and the more extended families? What's the impact on schooling? Financial consequences of this. Was there, in fact, relocation? Do you have health concern? Even if somebody was not directly in harm's way and directly not injured, just changes in the water, changes in diet, changes, having to move, being in the sun, having to be in a huge soccer stadium that was being opened up as a shelter. All of this will have an impact on health. And of course, what I've been talking for some time, the emotional impact. Anticipatory, this pertains to the buildup of the traumatic incident, preparing, bracing yourself, listening to the hurricane approaching. Okay, by 2 a.m. we expect that we're going to have heavy water and all of this. And I know that I was hearing in the news regarding the Hurricane Irma that there were warnings given that if you don't evacuate by such and such a time, that afterwards we will not respond to your call. We won't be able to. You have to appreciate that rescue workers themselves are being put in harm's way and are being used elsewhere. So it was very frightening to me to hear that there might actually be people who decide not to heed the warning and then are told, we're not going to be able to come and get you. And that's very sad. The media exposure, the visual displays, which is something I've already mentioned, and of course evacuations. And we know that in Houston there was a tremendous amount of evacuation. Of course, Florida had huge areas of evacuation as well. During the event, you're in harm's way. Are you in the eye of the destruction? Are you actually in the path of it? Are you in the periphery of it? Or are you in a zone that you should have left? What are the sounds of the impact? You hear the wind, you hear trees, you hear crashing sounds, the visual impact, breakage, glass. I remember in Superstorm Sandy, I had patients of mine telling me that they saw cars floating down a watered, flooded street. The house actually moved, so they're seeing this. They're hearing the breakage, loss of power. We still have people without power. Injury, loss of life, which is more serious, and other kinds of losses. You may have, some of your property, your treasured belongings, your loss of record collection, or the loss of pets, for instance. I'm a pet lover, and for me, that's something that would be very devastating for me. So, people placed in harm's way will be experiencing the loss of amenities. They don't have their property, they don't have their car, they don't have their items of everyday life. They actually may have lost their home. If they have to go to shelters or relocate, the losses may be permanent. There may be serious losses. Once you've lost your home, it's forever. You now have to consider where you're going to live and how you're going to finance it, the emotional impact, and what are the changes it's going to mean to you, to your family, to your children if they have to go to a different school. Physical health consequences, if you actually were harmed during the hurricane or the stressful event, you're having physical reactions and consequences because of that actual injury. You may also be experiencing health consequences from loss of appetite, poor sleep, reliance on pain medication, other kinds of medication, not taking care of yourself. So these are consequences that you also need to be aware of and can go on and can be enduring. The emotional consequences we've talked about, the depression, the anxiety, the PTSD, phobic responses, avoidance kinds of responses. Of particular concern is a prolonged aftermath. If you are in a situation where for several months you're relocated, or your house is destroyed and you're dealing with FEMA and you're dealing with other agencies trying to get you financial coverage to help you rebuild. All of this will take, in some instances, years. The depression can last for a long time, and there can be marked health and emotional consequences, again, depending on the severity of injuries, if any, and to whatever extent you may have neglected your own health and the emotional consequences, things like reliving the incident, seeing something on television, somebody asking you a question, can keep fueling, can keep reinforcing the original emotional trauma. You may have ups and downs, waxing and waning, but it's something that just never seems to go away. Self-search. This is something for anybody. This is really directed for caregivers. It's directed for first responders. It's directed for family members, parents, for Vistage members. You need to self-monitor your emotional and mental state as a result of this hurricane, whether it's Harvey or Irma or any traumatic tragedy. Keep an eye and check on yourself. You have to recognize the role of denial and minimization. I get many people, many patients, whether they are responders, whether they actually are rescue workers or victims of the traumatic event, who will deny, or I will ask them, for instance, do you have headaches? And I may get a response, not always. I didn't ask if you have headaches always. I asked if you have headaches. So there seems to be a minimization. And for some people, it's almost like I'm not allowed to have a reaction. I'm not allowed to feel physically something or to feel emotional. So you need to recognize that, because that can be a problem later on. And recognizing the impact of ignoring one's own needs. It will have potentially physical and emotional consequences. Outreach. For those who are in a situation where we want to be able to reach out and help victims or members who have had family or whose businesses have suffered or clientele has suffered, what are their needs? What exactly is it that you can do? How can you help? Can you help financially? Can you help by donating blankets, food? Can you help by making contributions to the Red Cross? Can you help by going someplace? Can you help by putting somebody up for a while? When is it that you can do this? Obviously, some needs are very, very immediate. Other needs are going to be long lasting. So it's something that you need to recognize over time. A year has gone by. Is this something that there's still a need for me to intervene in some way? The assistance can be organized and coordinated, for instance, Red Cross. It can be where you are just listening, active listening. What happened? Talk. Opportunity to get together, talk about the experience. Certainly maintaining communication, especially if you're dealing with vulnerable individuals, elderly, people with mental, physical disabilities, veterans, there's a myriad populations, and it's going to be different. I can't get into all of them, but there's many vulnerable populations, many people who are unempowered, disenfranchised, and it's important to be able to reach out to them and to maintain the communication and not forget about them. Little simple things, picking up a phone just to say hi, I was thinking about you. That's great. That's wonderful. It doesn't have to be that you pull out your checkbook and write that nice hefty check. You do what you're able to do, but simple things can have a tremendous impact. You need to know the resources, where you are, who or what organization is available to help, and what kind of help do they assist. As a psychologist, let me just share with you that from a psychological standpoint, there are tremendous resources that are available through the American Psychological Association. Their professional organization was called APAPO. Very simple Google search, you'll be able to get to their site. They have resources on emotional first aid, on the impact of hurricanes, the impact of floods, the impact of tornadoes, the impact on veterans, on children, and so forth. Each state also has their state psychological association. So for instance, in Texas, you have Texas Psychological Association, Florida Psychological Association. These are locations, these are associations you can look to for resources. In the long run, post-traumatic growth. This is something that pertains to recovery. How do you get over this? People will, in one way or another, there's going to be an aftermath. And it's very important to try to minimize the negative consequences of the aftermath and try to look for, search, and reinforce those experiences following a tragedy or an emotional trauma that are that are positive, that in some way develop or help you become more resilient. For instance, growth experiences in the aftermath. What did you do that made you stronger? What are some of the things that followed these difficult experiences that other people do that makes them emotionally more resilient? It's a positive mental shift. You don't want to belabor, you don't want to dwell and stick to the past. You have to recognize the past that happened. You don't want to ignore it. You don't want to say get over it. But you don't want to be driven by it. You know, it's over, it's done. You talk about it. What now? What's your future? What are the kinds of things that you need to do that will make you a stronger, physically stronger, and more emotionally healthy person? Examples of traumatic events that cause adversity. We're talking, you know, focusing on hurricanes, but there are other things: illnesses, loss of job, problems with children, violence, coping with suicide. I give you some numbers here so you can see the impact, for instance, of suicide. Threats of suicide, 25 attempts, and there's about 44,000 suicides a year, making it the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. I have no doubt that you are going to have individuals and people who in some way were placed in harm's way or devastated by these hurricanes, who will have passive suicidal thoughts. Why am I alive? I don't deserve to live. I can't live like this. It's horrible. And sadly, there will be individuals who are going to think about and actually contemplate on taking their lives. And that's something to really keep an eye on. What are some of the steps for post-traumatic growth? Facing the problem, developing narratives of the trauma and survival. By narrative, I mean a self-talk. You know, what is it that you did? Well, I did this. I got a hold of my family. I got flashlights. I got food. I got water. I packed up. I did this. I had to go to a shelter and relocate. And it was okay. We were able to survive. We were able to get over it. We're all healthy. We're doing well. We're trying to look forward to reestablishing our lives. Share and talk about the adversity. Seek help, support. Know when you need. Know when you need to get help. Know when you need to get different kinds of help, support from friends, loved ones, neighbors, colleagues at work, but also professional help and support. Looking inwards. What are your strengths? You know yourself. What is it that you're good at? What are the areas that you can really count on and try to focus on and reinforce? Appreciate what you have, even the little things. Focus on what's important going forward and prioritize. Obviously, the most important thing is survival, is your health, staying out of harm's way, coping with physical illness, physical injuries, and prioritizing the ravaging emotional consequences, and where are you going to live, financial situations, schooling, work. These are some of the things you're going to need to figure out and prioritize. Focus on new opportunities. You have to move. You're in a new location. What's available there? What can you do? What kinds of schools can the children go? Spiritual growth for people with religious beliefs. Many of my patients do have religious beliefs. I always welcome it and encourage it. If you have that spiritual belief, it's certainly something to rely on, and I embrace it. Resilience. This is the ability to withstand hardship, to remain psychologically healthy, bouncing back. To that extent that we recover and that we do well from prior traumatic incidents, we become more resilient. Things seem to bounce off. We become more adept at going forward, at going back to where we need to be, at going back to a baseline, at recovering. and doing it more quickly and being less affected by the impact of the devastating or distressing incident. Communication, you need to work on listening skills, active listening. For instance, you're talking to somebody, are you actually listening or just uh-huh? So active listening means that you're going to reflect, you're going to restate what the person said, you're going to clarify. You'll be assertive to the extent that if you're not in agreement with something, you'll say, well, for me, this is how I felt. Or you're saying that I look good. You're saying I look good physically, and by now, obviously, it shows that I'm doing well. Well, let me share with you. I may physically look okay, but I don't feel well. I do have these kinds of things, and I'm working on it. That's what I mean by being assertive. Conflict resolution skills. When you have areas of disagreement with people, you don't want to start yelling and becoming aggressive and walking away and not listening. You have to be able to say, okay, what is it that you want? This is what I want. How do you want to go about your way? How do I want to go about my way? Can we in some way engage in problem solving and see how we can listen to one another and resolve differences? Self-awareness. What are your strengths, assets? What are your protective factors? Do you have family? Do you have a support system, loved ones? Do you have some financial resources, some backup? What are your weaknesses, liabilities, risk factors? You're isolated. You're physically ill. You're wheelchair bound. You may have some physical infirmity that would require at least some recognition and some ability to be able to have the environment accommodate you. So these are the kinds of things that you would need to do. I have many patients and also many fellow psychologists who need some sort of assistance, a cane or a walker, and it's so important if you're going to have a meeting to have it in a facility that has elevators or that takes into consideration what their needs are. So this is what I mean by risk factors. Obviously, if somebody's physically unable to walk out of their home and they are in harm's way during a flood, that's a risk factor. If you're completely isolated, you're by yourself, that's a risk factor. What are your goals, short and long term? By short, what do you see going down 3 months from now? That's what I refer to as short. Long term, a year from now, 2 years from now. Try to set up the priorities. What's your purpose in life? What is it that you yourself as a person, what's important to you? How do you want to go forward with this and try to prioritize these things?
Dr. Aranda, I think you've done a spectacular job, and I don't have any questions. I do think this is really timely, given that we've just been through these two big hurricanes, and probably many Vistage members are affected or know family members or business associates that are affected. So I just say thank you so much for sharing both a better understanding of what people will be experiencing and some great ideas for how to deal with it if it affected us ourselves or somebody that is important in our businesses and our lives.
Okay, just by way of wrapping myself up very quickly on a personal level, I do want to wish and express my sympathy to those who lost loved ones, and certainly my heart goes out to all of those who in some way were affected by this and were placed in harm's way. And I do hope that the Vistage members are aware that there's so many things that they can do, but as well to recognize that if and when you really can't go beyond a certain point, that there may come a time that you do have to make a referral to a professional, and not to be shy about that, not to in some ways wait too long to recommend professional assistance in some ways. So again, thank you for having me here, and I really hope that we as a nation and our members recover from these events as quickly and as effectively as possible.
I couldn't say it any better myself. Folks, if you're interested in learning more about Vistage, please check out Vistage.com. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Vistage podcast series. We'll see you next time.